Lecturette number 2. The lie that Britain can only economically prosper if an EU member. There's a couple of misconceptions, again perpetuated by none other than Europhiles, which suggests that to compete economically with the US, China and that of further emerging economies such as from India and Brazil, Britain must remain in the EU. A Labour member, and I won't mention any names here, told me that Britain would not stand a chance with competing with the US and China and so on if she were to withdraw from the EU. Furthermore, if that weren't enough, this same person suggested that if Britain were to leave the EU, her economy would implode. I'm sure you will not be shocked, but this person provided no justification for the claims they made. Of course, this specific person stated these claims as if they were fact, as if a Nobel Prize-winning scientist had discovered them in a laboratory. Of course, according to Europhiles, they are facts, but in actuality, they are mere factoids. That is, they are items of unreliable information that is repeated so often that it becomes accepted as fact, despite the fact that it is not a fact. Here's some real evidence which suggests that the EU itself cannot ever economically compete with the US and China. The EU's own figures show that the European Union's share of global gross domestic product, GDP, halving in contrast to the US by 2050. Additionally, the economic growth rates of the Eurozone serve further still to disprove the EU as a current or potential future economic powerhouse. Between 2001 and 2006, the Eurozone economy grew 10%. In the same time period, the US economy grew at 18.1% and the British economy, which, may I remind you, is external to the Eurozone, grew at a respectable 15.8%. The euro is a shambles. It's still on its knees from the recession that kicked off in 2008. The potential of the EU to be an economic powerhouse bears as much validity as the claim that horses can in fact turn into butterflies. That is, it is a totally absurd notion to even suggest that Britain is economically better off in the EU. Britain has more chance of competing economically by leaving the EU, regaining full sovereignty and taking its economic reins back to the central authority of the British Parliament. Furthermore, the IMF still project a dim outlook for the Eurozone. By the end of 2011, the Eurozone economy is projected to have grown a miserable 1.3%, while the US is projected a growth of 3.3%, China 9.6%, and the UK 2.1%, higher than any of those states belonging to the Eurozone. The Eurozone is killing and has killed many of the economies that make it up. Look at Greece, Spain and Italy, for example. Britain cannot flourish socially, let alone economically, while a member of the EU. As Article 120 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union states, Member States shall conduct their economic policies with the view to contributing to the achievement of the objectives of the Union. Is that not enough to make you realise that we genuinely are shackled by EU overregulation? One further example, Article 121.1 states that Member States shall regard their economic policies as a matter of common concern and shall coordinate them with the European Council. Now, I'm sorry, but anyone who thinks that Britain is economically better off in the EU is seriously misguided. At any rate, what Europhiles conveniently forget to mention is that Britain, upon completing its withdrawal from the EU, could negotiate its way into signing free trade agreements with the EU. This would be so much better, especially if economic prosperity is what Europhiles are allegedly concerned with. This way, we trade freely with the EU. No economic nationalism is partaken by either the EU or the UK, therefore benefiting both, albeit without Britain being politically binded to EU economic regulations and bureaucracy. More important, being able to establish our own laws and exercise real democracy in a democratic, independent manner. This way, as already suggested, Britain wouldn't have to deal with the bureaucracy and over-regulation to which the EU subscribes. I'm sure that our Europhile inhabitants would be quick to say that the EU wouldn't agree to a free trade agreement, but a great rejoinder would be to remind them that the EU needs British trade more than the British need the EU. Moreover, Mexico has a free trade agreement with the EU, as do many other countries. We can do the same. We do not need to be a part of the EU to trade with the EU. And guess what? The EU even say this themselves. Firstly, Article 50.1 of the Treaty on European Union states that any member state may decide to withdraw from the Union. Now, Article 50.2 declares that a member state which decides to withdraw shall notify the European Council of its intention. It goes on to say, the Union shall negotiate and conclude an agreement with the withdrawing state, taking into account the state's future relationship with the Union. The Union would not want to lose British business. The Union would not want to lose British imports and the ability to export to Britain. Don't believe Europhile horror stories that our economy will collapse if we leave the EU. On the contrary, it will only get stronger.